So today I'm standing at 5 Points, and behind me is the beautiful Simcoe Hotel. There's been a hotel on that spot for a very long time. The first one popped up about 1856. It would have been a wooden and rough cast building, as all the business buildings in this sector would have been. And about 1870-ish, Michael Shaughnessy became the proprietor. And he advertised that he was greatly improving it and welcomed everyone to come in. All your lumber barons and your farmers, come on in and have a nice time in my hotel. So he continued to improve it until it came to a crashing stop in February 13th of 1876, when the good people of Barrie were rudely awakened by the fire alarms going. The stable behind the Simcoe Hotel was on fire. So the fire department was here quite quick. They brought with them their engine, and no team of horses to pull it was forthcoming for whatever reason. So they were forced to drag the entire apparatus down the street to Kempenfelt Bay, crack the ice, get some water, and haul it back up. They lost a half an hour, which was quite a bit of time in that kind of circumstances, and the stable was lost and the hotel was well on its way. So yes, it burnt down. Michael Shaughnessy was not one to quit, apparently, so he rebuilt quite quickly, as seemed to happen in those days. He rebuilt by December of 1876, and the result was what you see behind me, that gorgeous Flatiron building. So he continued to operate with 46 nice new bedrooms in there and welcomed all sorts of guests, including, so the story goes, Sir John A. Macdonald. He would come to Barrie to visit his relative by marriage, Dalton McCarthy, and they were also political allies. One thing that Sir John A. didn't seem to care for about the town of Barrie was his mother-in-law, Mrs. Bernard. And apparently he would come down to the Simcoe, have a few drinks with the lads, and then stay the night, anything to avoid the mother-in-law. So they say anyway. Another story, which is a sad and tragic one, is the oft-told story about Mrs. Elizabeth Meyer. She was a 35-year-old lady of the town who had fallen on hard times. And one evening in January of 1872, she was found lying in an unconscious state on the steps of this hotel, the steps that you can see behind me. So the patrons brought her in, but there was nothing could be done for the lady, and she expired. So very soon afterwards, Dr. Cruikshank convened an inquest, and the result of that said that 3 factors contributed to her death. The first one being intemperance, or the overuse of alcohol. The second one being the exposure to the extreme cold, and the third being the injuries that she had received from an unknown source. So even to this day, employees, past and present, say that they feel like something unusual is going on in that hotel. They feel like Elizabeth is there, still trying to communicate with them, perhaps to encourage them to uncover what really happened to her. But that hasn't happened yet. Okay, now we're over by the Queen's Hotel. It's one of the very oldest, but not exactly how you see it. So to backtrack, the Queen's Hotel, as confusing as this might sound, is not the Queen's Hotel, historically speaking. So to clarify and back up a little bit, there were 2 hotels in direct competition in this same block on the north side of Dunlop Street, bounded by Owen Street in Mulcaster. One of them was the Barrie Hotel, and that is actually what is now named the Queen's. The original Queen's was further down the street towards Mulcaster, just a few doors from Mulcaster, and it was a very large hotel that took up a great big block. So those 2 hotels competed side by side for a long time. Both of them started likely in the 1830s. And then in the 1870s, they began to up their game a bit by putting on additions. The Barrie Hotel added 30 rooms that year, and they made them of brick, because after 1871, there had been so many fires in this town, they had created a bylaw that said no more building with wood. So if you wanted to make any kind of additions to your building, it had to be brick. So there you go. In 1914, a small fire happened at the Queen's Hotel near Mulcaster. It didn't destroy the hotel, but the fire chief, Mr. George Smith, dropped dead of a heart attack while fighting the fire. Another fire happened less than 2 months later, and that was a destructive fire. That fire destroyed that entire block. And there's still a hole in that block that you can see today that doesn't match the rest of the Victorian buildings if you take a good look at it. So when the hotel burnt down, there was all kinds of legal wrangling came about afterwards. Several lawsuits occurred, and in the end, the town of Barrie took it over and sold it. They sold it to Mr. Franklin F.W. Livingston, and he started a car dealership there. And that building still remains. That would be 1926 that happened. He also was the builder of 2 other buildings that became the Eaton store and the bowling alley, and in 1966 those burnt down. So really the only remaining building is the car dealership, which I think, if you see behind me, says Small Biz on the facade right now. But what happened also was the Queen's Hotel, the name remains. The Barrie Hotel in 1920 took over that name. I'm not sure why, maybe it was a well-known name. So for the last 100 years, the Barrie Hotel has been operating under the sign of the Queen's Hotel, just as you see behind me. The Clarkson was built by Joshua Clarkson. He started off as an innkeeper at the Commercial Hotel in the 1860s, and by 1871 he felt like he wanted to branch out on his own. So he started that hotel that bore his name till very recently, so about 150 years. Of those 150 years, Joshua Clarkson himself was only there for about 9 of them. So he opened the hotel, and it carried on just like all the other wonderful hotels in downtown Barrie, and it was connected with all kinds of stories, a lot of them your average drunkenness stories and infractions with the liquor board. And in 1879, his free-range turkey got in a fight with a large Newfoundland dog from across the street, and I'm happy to report that the turkey won, defending his hotel. In 1871, a couple of roommates sharing a room had a bit of a disagreement. One charged the other with theft when he found the next morning that both his underwear and his wallet had gone missing. So that was the Clarkson in its heyday. By 1880, Joshua Clarkson had had enough of the hotel business, so he sold. He sold to Mr. Armitage, and Joshua Clarkson went into the ginger beer business. He produced pop of all sorts. And in 1909, Joshua Clarkson died from cholera, which I find a little bit ironic since he spent his life in the business of either alcoholic or soft drinks, and he was taken out by a waterborne illness. A story that comes from the 1920s that I really like. 1927, The Mystery Man was the title that the Barrie papers gave this particular story. Thomas Baggs was a CNR employee, and he had lived for over 10 years in a room in the Clarkson. Even though he had bought himself a house on John Street and fully furnished it and spent a night in it, he decided, I suppose, that he didn't like living alone, perhaps no one to cook for him, perhaps no one to do his laundry, so he remained in the Clarkson. On Christmas Day of 1927, he took ill, and Dr. Turnbull was sent for, and he recommended a visit to the hospital immediately. Thomas Baggs said, no hospital for me. So the result of that was he was found dead in his bed in the hotel the next morning. So next came the search for family for Thomas Baggs. They tore apart his room in search of letters, any connection to his home that he had alluded to was in England. They took apart the house. They found nothing helpful. They did find money. He had money squirreled away in the John Street house. He had $445 in his pocket, which, if you calculate it to today's value, is close to $7,000. So the papers asked if anybody knew anything. They said if there's no will, if there's no anything, the money will go to the Crown, which is what I imagine must have happened. I don't think any family was ever found, but I would really like to solve that mystery. So on this spot used to be the Victoria Hotel. No one remembers that one. It's been gone for a very long time. The Victoria Hotel was started about 1868 by an innkeeper named John Johns. And by about 1877, it was greatly improved. It was bricked and had some elaborate verandas added to it, right about the same time that the market building was improved and had all kinds of beautiful additions made. So that was probably the heyday of the Victoria Hotel. So as you can see, the Victoria Hotel is gone. It ceased to exist probably in the first decade of the 20th century. And replacing it came this building here. This was the original Barrie Public Library. In 1914, the old library, which existed in a building on Owen Street, just up from Dunlop, just behind where Hooligan's bar and restaurant is now, that library had kind of ceased to be useful, so they needed a new one. And luckily, a wonderful campaign was happening at that time. Andrew Carnegie of Dunfermline, Scotland, turned steel magnate in North America, had all kinds of money that he was giving away to anyone who applied for it who wanted to build a library. Thousands of them were built in the States, hundreds in Canada, and the town at that time of Barrie applied for a grant and received a grant of some $16,000, and they built this building here, and it became Barrie's Library, and that would have opened in 1914. And when the new library was built, in recent years, this became the McLaren Arts Centre as you see today. Most famous person likely attached to this hotel would be a former innkeeper by the name of Michael Brennan. And he worked at the Victoria for a while, and probably while he was working in Barrie, he met a young lady by the name of Mary Ann Hurley. And Mary Ann was in the employ of a well-to-do man named John Strathy. Mary Ann worked as a cook for Mr. Strathy and his family until she married Michael Brennan. So she left his employ, as was customary at that time. So Mary Ann and Michael had 4 children together, all of them born in Barrie, and then they moved to Midland. And things didn't go so well after that. Michael began to experience some mental health issues, and in the end, Mary Ann took the children and went to her mother. And Michael took other work. He went to Toronto and started working for the Massey Harris Company. After a while, he began to think, I would like to get my family back. How am I going to do this? Well, I'll go up to Barrie. That's a good starting place. So he came up to Barrie. This would be about 1896 by this time, early in the year, and he stayed at the Victoria Hotel. He was very familiar with the place. And he happened to be in the market across the street when he saw a familiar face, Mr. John Strathy. He thought, I bet John knows where my family is. So he spoke to John Strathy, who was rather annoyed, and said, I don't know anything about your family. Go on about your day, leave me alone. That wasn't the end of it. Michael went back to Toronto, and he stewed and he simmered, and his tortured mind began to think, that Strathy knows just where they are. So he came to Barrie again. He took the train back to Barrie, and he arrived on Mr. Strathy's doorstep one day with a pistol in his pocket. And Mr. Strathy was even more annoyed to see him there and bodily removed him from his property. Michael was having none of it. He shot Mr. Strathy, and he got into a sleigh, and he came back to this part of town and went into the Victoria Hotel. And he spoke to all the other patrons in the bar, and he had no problem admitting what he'd done because he felt he was quite justified. He also didn't know at this time that he had in fact killed Mr. Strathy. So confident was he in his justification that he went across to the market and this time encountered Constable Marin, to whom he confessed. Constable Marin must have been quite taken aback, but he brought his now prisoner to the Barrie jail, and the rest, as they say, is history. But to go further, he was tried and convicted and sentenced to hang. And that was overturned. He did have mental health issues, that was overturned. But a new trial was had, and again, he was found guilty. So our hotel behind us that isn't there anymore used to be the American Hotel, lovingly called the Yank by local people in Barrie. Its original name was the Mansion House, and it was a 3-story building built originally of brick. It was built in the days after brick was a law, no more rough cast buildings. So it was the mansion house from 1874 till about 1879, when it became the American and stayed as the American for many decades. The hotels in Barrie were not quite as you might picture them. This three-story building, the lower floor, as it would be on Dunlop Street if it had been built there, was usually shops. There was a painter, there was an ironmonger, there was different people there. So you would have walked in the front door and then gone up a flight of stairs. The second floor would be where the actual bar room would be. So, and then there was bedrooms for guests. The third floor would have the same. Perhaps the family lived in the establishment, very likely. So I'm telling you these things to set the stage for a story that is widely known in connection to the hotel. The hotel was fairly new when it got this tragic story attached to it. So St. Patrick's Day of 1877, a young man who had been staying at the Victoria Hotel. He was a marble cutter, likely employed just down the street here. He left the hotel to go across the street and perhaps do some visiting or what have you at the American Hotel, and he could hear a sound. He could hear almost like a moaning sound. And it was dark, of course, so he got closer and he could see a form lying on the sidewalk outside the American Hotel, which was called the Mansion then. He was quite sure it was a person, but he was a little frightened, so he ran upstairs and he appealed to the hotel keeper. He said, "There's somebody dying outside," is how he worded it. The hotel keeper wasn't very concerned, but he did join his new friend and went downstairs, and when they found this form, they immediately recognized it as James Curran Morrow. This young man was well known to everyone. He lived nearby. He was a clerk with the county of Simcoe. His father, David Morrow, was a justice of the peace, so he was quite well known. So they picked him up and they took him into the hotel. They took him upstairs and lay him in a bed, and they called for the doctors. So the doctors came and had a look at him, and they pronounced it quite serious. They seemed to think that they should probably call the family. But of course the mystery was, how did he get there? What is he doing here? So the family came and the doctors came, and they decided that he had fallen. He had fallen likely from the second story. Now the thing about the second story is, you wouldn't expect it, but there was a door on the second story, a door for a balcony that wasn't yet constructed. So what happened? Did he fall? Did he jump? What happened? What they pieced together was he had come in probably about 7 o'clock in the evening and gone upstairs to the bar room, and he was tired. Why he didn't go home for a nap, we don't know, but he decided to take a nap in the rooms of the hotel owner. So he had a nap. Nobody saw him get up and leave, but he likely mistook the second floor door for the front entrance door. So he was found in a very bad state on the ground. So he lived perhaps 28 hours after his injuries, and then he died. He had a severe head injury, as you can imagine. The ones that stayed with him all night said he raved and thrashed, but in the end he succumbed to his injuries. The worst part of it, though, was the fact that when they undressed him from his overcoat, they found no money on him. A handful of pennies was all, and they found the chain for his watch, but not the gold watch that he customarily brought with him everywhere. So this dying man had been robbed on the streets of Barrie. The only thing that came of it, maybe a month later, some school children playing at the central school found a smashed watch in the playground behind the school. Obviously, whoever had taken it didn't realize the notoriety, the fact that he was a well-known young man in town. They didn't want to be attached to this sort of evidence, and so ridded themselves of the piece of jewelry. And that is the story of the Morrow tragedy at the American Hotel in 1877.